Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin, eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. I hope this vlog post finds you well and healthy and maybe enjoying a little bit of time with your family up close and personal. I got a request this week to cover an album that I hadn't really thought about doing a post for, but it ended up being an interesting excursion into an album that I kind of hadn't thought about in a while. That album being Duran Duran. Now, it's called Duran Duran, but it's actually very often referred to as the wedding album to help to differentiate it from the band's 1981 debut album. If you're a person who is in junior high school around the time that I was, you know who Duran Duran is. They were referred to at the time as the Fab Five because they had such a huge hype around them, screaming fans, and the whole thing was like the Beatles Part 2. And of course, because they were so hip at the time, I was very against Duran Duran when I was in junior high school. But, time wore on, and a few years later, after the hype had died down, I had gone back and listened to their music and accepted that actually Duran Duran was a pretty killer band in their day. And I actually remember seeing them in 1989 at a place, a smaller venue in Austin, and being really, really impressed by the show. So I became a Duran Duran fan kind of after the fact, especially of their kind of classic trilogy of albums, those first three albums that they released, Duran Duran, Rio, and Seven and the Ragged Tiger. I love those albums, and I will tell you that someday I may do a series on those three albums because they're absolutely worth looking at from both a cultural and a musical standpoint. But the point of this album is what kind of happens after that. Because after Seven and the Ragged Tiger happened, there was some splitting happening in the group, and they started doing these side projects, Power Station and Arcadia. And I listened to the Power Station. I followed that one for a while. I didn't really get into Arcadia. And then whenever the band got back together, things weren't really quite the same. They released an album, I think, called Big Thing, and had a song Notorious on that just didn't quite resonate. And so I kind of lost interest in them, and they kind of also fell out of favor in the public eye. There were some people that left the band. Original guitar player and the original drummer had left. And one of the people that was one of their sidemen was this gentleman named Warren Cuccurullo. And Warren Cuccurullo is worth mentioning here because by the time the wedding album came out, Warren Cuccurullo was a full-fledged member of Duran Duran. And he's particularly interesting because he got his start in Frank Zappa's band. And it seems very odd, if you're a fan of Frank Zappa and know what kind of work that Frank Zappa did, to think of a person who's so avant-garde and so bizarre in his musical output, would produce somebody that would eventually be evolved in Duran Duran, and especially sort of like a soft rock version of their incarnations. But Warren Cuccurullo, if you look at his history, kind of actually fits Duran Duran really well. He, after leaving Frank Zappa's band, he kind of got his new wave cred by playing with the Missing Persons. The Missing Persons was a group made almost entirely out of Frank Zappa alumni. As much as he was a member of Frank Zappa's band, Warren Cuccurullo also was a very important kind of piece of maybe not quite mainstream, but just outside of the mainstream new wave music. And so it was not a weird step for him to step into Duran Duran and actually end up becoming a full-fledged member. And my understanding was that Warren Cuccurullo's input on the wedding album was pretty substantial. A lot of the big hit songs off of the album had his input on them. His guitar playing kind of vacillates back and forth between being very in the pocket, standard guitar playing, and also kind of having some edgier moments with his guitar playing here and there with the album. So his presence on the album is actually, I think, worth mentioning. Now look, Duran Duran's shift towards a more adult contemporary style was a little bit hard to take at the time, but really in retrospect, you have to wonder what else they could have possibly done at that time. Okay, so it's 1993, and we don't see this as much now, but certainly back then, what was popular on the radio and the songs that people knew about was decided by people in the record industry and people in the entertainment industry. So certainly by the time that Duran Duran had come around to 1993, they were considered pretty much anachronisms. They were so closely tied to 1980s culture, especially early 80s culture, that it was going to be a hard sell for them to do anything but what they'd already done before. And they certainly couldn't really do grunge at that time. That wouldn't have worked for them. They could have maybe stepped into a little bit more dance raver style culture, but even that would have been kind of unbelievable for them to really commit to that. So the move, at that point, all they really had was their songwriting skills. So for them to move into that more adult contemporary rock, it wasn't really that far of a step. It feels uncomfortable because they've lost so much edge that almost in some ways it's not quite the same band. But in many ways, they weren't the same band at that point. You know, they were a 4-piece band with Warren Cuccurullo installed in the group, and 10 years had gone by. And they were just trying to find a way to make themselves relevant, you know. And despite what 1983 Duran Duran might have thought of 1993 Duran Duran, 1993 Duran Duran had to find a way to move forward. And so they made that stylistic shift to be a little bit more of an adult contemporary group, and quite successfully in many regards, even though it may feel uncomfortable to those of us who miss the edge, who miss the almost punk underpinnings of their earlier work. I'm not the hugest proponent of the Wedding album as a whole, but consider this, you know, Duran Duran's classic albums were still being put out in the early 80s when the limitations of vinyl kind of prescribed how long an album could be. About 45 minutes, 50 minutes if you're willing to lose a little bit of fidelity. And that, of course, that length dictated, you know, tapes, which is the other popular medium at the time. So all of Duran Duran's earlier albums were pretty lean 45-minute albums. And even the songs that were not super popular on those albums were really great songs. I mean, listen to Rio, you won't find a dud in the playlist. They're all killer. I think that if you would apply that same mindset to Duran Duran's Wedding album, I mean, that's a 63-minute album. The limitations of how much you could put on an album had grown by that point, and people were always kind of testing to see how much they actually could put on an album and make it work. And I feel like if you could take 4 or 5 tracks of this album and just cut it and get some editing out of it, you would have actually probably had a little bit leaner and a little bit better album overall. And what those tracks are, you know, is sort of to a degree a matter of opinion. I would take tracks out like UHF, or maybe Femme Fatale, which is a cover that I just feel like is a little bit flaccid, you know. I am kind of not a fan of the song Breath by Breath on the album, but I do respect its concept. I respect the concept behind the song, because Duran Duran had a following in South America and in Brazil. There's a popular Brazilian artist singing in Portuguese for a good portion of the song, and he sort of he trades vocal lines back and forth with Simon Le Bon, and eventually they sing the lyrics on top of each other with Portuguese and English kind of happening at the same time. It's a nice moment.
Every day I wake up in this room, and I don't know where I come from, where I'm going to. Then I hear the voice, Senhora Musa da Paz, me abraça, me carrega.
Agora entrega de vez meu rumo e vida.
From where I stand, the truth is in black and white. Alone we live and die, we love and fight. Breath after breath we carry this mortal coil. Save for tomorrow.
Breath After Breath is clearly a love letter to Duran Duran's Brazilian fans. And you can't fault them for wanting to tap into that that rather large market. South America kept Queen alive after 1980 for a long time. Radio Gaga was a huge hit down there. And by that time, the USA had kind of given up on Queen. So there's a big market down there, and you really can't blame him for wanting to tap into that. But there's also some sort of, I don't know, some melodies just seem a little bit careless on it, and he has some lyrics that are just kind of ad-libbed the melody of the lyrics, and it kind of works. And then there's parts where there's a little bit more definition to the song. So I'm mixed on that one, but that could be one that I think is not one of the stronger songs of the album. It possibly could be cut, depending upon if you got the US version or the Brazilian version, I suppose. But you really can't talk about the Wedding album without talking about the big hits on the album. And there's about 2 or 3 of them. But the biggest one, and the one that's really fueled my interest in the album most recently, is the song Ordinary World. The song, arguably, is about a person dealing with a breakup. But it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to listen to the lyrics and look at them and just notice that it's really just kind of about loss in general. And especially the context of the song, not just dealing with loss, but trying to find the new normal in light of loss.
Crazy summer say, where is my friend when I need you most? Come away, but I won't cry for yesterday. There's an ordinary world somehow I have to find. And as I try to make my way to the ordinary world, I will learn to
We've lost a lot in the last couple of weeks, and the idea of what the new normal is and what it's going to be 6 months from now, a year from now, it feels a little foolhardy to even postulate what that's going to look like. So we're very on unsteady ground right now, and everybody's trying to figure out what the new ordinary is, what the ordinary world's going to look like. And so even though the song was made in 1993 and was about something, I think arguably about something else, it's open-ended enough in its lyrics to be able to subjectively be reinterpreted. The song is very strong. Ordinary World's a great tune, and there are many other really great tunes on the Wedding album. I don't know that I would suggest the album as a whole to listen to, as it's not really going to be like a classic album, I don't think, as a whole. But certainly its standout moments are things that are memorable and worth noting. And certainly as an album that's a comeback album for a band that was so iconic a decade before, it's worth thinking about how they reinvented themselves in several ways to try to find a way to be relevant in sort of their new world at the time. So that's my opinions and thoughts about the Wedding album. If you guys have any ideas about it, please let me know. I'd be willing to certainly discuss it further. If you like the video, please like it and subscribe to it, and share it out if you feel so inclined. I have a playlist happening over on Spotify. You can follow me over there if you'd like. And again, please make sure you take time to contact and talk with your loved ones however way you can. And please take this extra time too. I have to really advocate for this, to try to support musicians and independent music if at all possible. If you're a person who streams music, go to Bandcamp, go to artist sites, buy directly from the artist, because we're going to need the perspective of artists continuing forward, I think, to help us find our way as the world progresses in a new direction. Okay. And I will have a new album review for you guys next week. And until then, I'll catch you guys on the flip side.